What's up, Wizards? Hope your Friday night, your Saturday morning, whenever you're watching this, is going well. I'm Deb from the place we like it of Magic, and today we got more Lost Caverns of Ixalan spoilers for you. Can you believe it? There's 20 more cards to look at from today, and there's a couple of pieces from this batch that I think might actually be kind of like straight up broken, and then there's a bunch of utility pieces that are bound to see play in a bunch of different formats. So it's basically like every other day we've seen so far. This set looks freaking incredible, and today was no different, so let's get to it. Let's start things off with Compass Gnome, or as my 8th grade geometry teacher would have said, Compass Gnome, but we've also got Malamet Warscribe and Defossilize. Now, Gnome is 2 mana for a 2/1 artifact creature that is also a gnome, and when it ETBs, you may search your library for a basic land or cave card, reveal it, shuffle the library, and put the card on top. We've seen a bunch of stuff like this, I feel like recently, like in the last few years, like every set has a dude kind of exactly like this, so he's not too special. That's why we're starting things off with him, but in Limited he might be okay. Get your land drops, get your caves, that seems kind of important, so not a terrible guy. Malamet Warscribe is an interesting take on like a white overrun effect in Limited. This is 5 mana, 3 and 2 white for a 4/3 cat warrior. When it ETBs, creatures you control get +2/+1 till end of turn. That's not too bad, especially considering you get a pretty decent body, right? You're not too worried as much, at least, about the crackback because you got a nice little fat blocker sitting there waiting to pounce on something. In the meantime, all your guys get through for hopefully alpha, but this is not a bad little boost. It sucks that it's 5 whole mana, but I do think this is going to be the top end of a lot of Limited aggro decks, so do look out for it. Well, let's check out Defossilize, the reanimation spell of this set. It is 5 mana, as you would expect it to be. That's the going rate these days. 4 and a black for a sorcery. Return target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. That creature explores, and then they explore again. What's cool about this reanimation spell is that in your reanimator deck, it puts more cards in the graveyard, theoretically at least, to reanimate. I kind of like that about it. You don't get a whole lot of reanimation spells that also fuel further reanimation. So that's kind of nice. You might draw a couple of lands. Creature gets a little bit bigger. All of it's pretty sweet. I mean, 5 mana upside is what we've been seeing out of reanimation spells, and I don't think this is much better or anywhere near as good, really, if I'm being honest. It's like the cruelty of Gix. I don't think it sees too much standard play, but it is kind of neat. Let's take a little step up here and look at Hurl into History and Curator of Sun's Creation. Now, Hurl into History is 5 mana, 3 and 2 blue for an instant. Counter target artifact or creature spell. Discover X, where X is that spell's mana value. Man, I want to like this so much, but I guess my glib hipster Magic player take is 5 mana Essence Scatter, scuffed. But I guess if we want to be a little bit more nuanced about it, I should say that although conventional wisdom says 5 mana is too much for a counter spell, especially one this narrow, it's very narrow. I will say that one of the things this card kind of has going for it a little bit is the fact that it's a 5 mana card, right? What I mean by that is that if you counter like a 4-drop spell with this, you lost mana value. Control players don't feel good about that, but you can guarantee that you're not going to discover with this card and then spin into another copy of it, which could potentially feel pretty bad. Now, you could still spin into a Make Disappear or a 3-mana counterspell, and that could also potentially still feel kind of bad. So you have to build your deck accordingly, and this card presents some challenges in that department. But all that said, I think it's kind of neat, because if you can counter something and get a Wandering Emperor or Wedding Announcement, then that is a ridiculous amount of value, I think. It swings the game fairly easily. So I think this card has something going for it, but I don't think you're going to see a whole bunch of copies of it in just about anything if it shows up at all. 5 mana is, again, let me just kind of fish hook back around to this. 5 mana is too much for a counter spell. But hey, people said the same thing about Draining Whelk when it first came out, and look what happened with it. It became a beloved and important card in the annals of MTG competitive history. So you just never know. It's hard to call these things sometimes. Let's move on over to Curator of Sun's Creation. You've been looking at it the whole time I've been talking about the other card. You've probably read it by now, but just in case. It's 4 mana, 3 and a red for a 3/3 human artificer. Whenever you discover again for the same value. This ability triggers only once per turn. Dangerous card, y'all, I'm telling you, but I do think it's priced out of most competitive play. 4 mana is an awful lot, especially when it doesn't do much the turn it comes into play. If you can devise a way to cascade the same turn this comes into play, I think you're doing pretty good, but it's going to be harder than you think. A good bit of the time, especially if you want to do it on curve. I don't really know how you're making that happen, but either way, barring any Magic Christmas Land scenarios, I think this is a little bit tough to actually get online in time to feel like you're really doing anything against your opponent, especially the farther back you go. I mean, in Modern, is this see in play? I really doubt it, but just like I was saying with the last card, that can be hard to gauge sometimes because this is a very powerful looking ability. Imagine cascading twice in the same turn just because you feel like it. So, it seems pretty ridiculous if you can get it up and running. But up next, the 5-year-old in me wants to look at the dinosaur stuff. So let's look at Earthshaker Dreadmaw. That's right, it's a 6-mana, 6/6 Dreadmaw. But it's not the one you probably expected. This is a dinosaur, of course, with trample. And when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card for each other dinosaur you control. You know, pretty much every day that new cards from this set come out, I see a thing that would be really, really broken with that artifact in Commander that makes all your creatures every creature type. It gives all your creatures changeling or something like that. Yet another, just throw another one on the fire, I guess. This is a ridiculous card alongside that card. But obviously, it's pretty sweet in dinosaur decks if you got a little bit of ramp and you're getting this on like turn 4 or 5 or something like that, drawing 3 cards, getting your little refill, like let's go. Especially if you have a way to blink it or something, that seems disgusting. Maybe reanimate it, put it back on the table and draw 3 or 4, like let's go. But in some situations, I have to acknowledge this. You're either not going to get to this card in the first place or it's going to draw you 0 cards. Like, you know, after the sweeper, this is on curve after like every sweeper in standard. So obviously there's going to be times where you just drop this and you played Colossal Dreadmaw. But strictly better Colossal Dreadmaw, you know, 6-mana, 6/6 trample and draw some cards. If this said just draw a card for each dinosaur you control, would be way more in business. But the word other on this depresses me quite a bit. But if you do have like 2 other dinosaurs out and drawing a couple of cards, that is probably the exact point in the game where you need this refill. So I'm not going to bar this from the idea of seeing any sort of competitive play. If dinosaurs is a real thing, you might see a copy or 2 of this. Again, especially if they have like reliable ramp. But there are a bunch of situations where the card's not that good. But I guess the last thing I have to say about it is that even if you drop it and it draws 0 cards, opponent still has to answer a 6/6 trample. It's easier said than done. But let's look at a ridiculous dinosaur. This one will almost certainly see play, especially if there is a dinosaurs deck, but I don't even think there has to be a dinosaurs deck for Scytheclaw Raptor to get in on the fun, man. This is 3 mana, 2 and a red for a 4/3 dino. Whenever a player casts a spell, if it isn't their turn, Scytheclaw Raptor deals 4 damage to them. Who? So, you know, don't play with fire your opponent at the end of their turn anymore. That's kind of lame. But who cares if they try to like Wandering Emperor you on your turn? It's still kind of like life negative for them, which is really, really sweet. But, you know, aside from that, if they're trying to counter spells or remove your dudes or just whatever, they try to mess with you on your side of the table on your turn. 4 damage. And like, God forbid if they want to cast like 2 different spells on your turn, 8 damage, right? But even if all they really want to do is mess with your combat step or something, it's going to cost them. And that kind of insurance, I think, will be highly prized in mono red as it is built at the moment, especially considering it's always switching out 3 drops, you know. Had Reckless Stormseeker for a while, junked that card. Get in here, Squee. Squee? Who cares about Squee? We got Godric now. Hey, Godric, get in here, Gotti. But now I think that we might actually play a couple of copies of this card, especially sideboard. But I think it's main deckable, right? A 3 mana 4/3 is fine. And if they ever try to do anything to you, they're taking a buttload of damage. That is a 5th of their life total. I mean, they basically just can't cast spells on your turn, more or less. If they try to take this out the turn that you play it, that's 4 damage. It has ward 4 life in that case. You know, all of your guys kind of do. So it's just kind of dumb to me. I think this card is destined to see a lot of plays. If you can't tell, I'm excited. It's a good card. Well, let's take a look at Queen's Bay Paladin next. This is 5 mana, 3 and 2 black for a 5/4 Vampire Knight. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, return up to 1 target vampire card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. You lose life equal to its mana value. Remember, finality counters mean that when they die, they're exiled. So this is like an Olivia that's pretty good at getting an Olivia, actually, when it enters the battlefield. If you've been able to bend one, grab an Olivia, sure, you take 6. Who cares? I don't care. You get another card out of your graveyard, and you just swing, let's go. So that's a neat little trick, but I just like the idea of having an Olivia that basically costs less than an Olivia. Let's go. My only gripe about this is that it's vampire specific, and that's kind of lame because it's 5 mana, right? Like in the eventual like vampires deck that kind of already exists. This is way too expensive to see any actual play in an aggro deck that is really, really low on curve for the most part. So I'm not sure it sees play there, but if you do have a kind of mid-range deck that just happens to play strong vampires, I could see slotting a copy or 2 of this in. It seems fun. But next, let's take a look at what is perhaps my pick for sleeper of the day here. It's Subterranean Scooner. 2 mana, 1 and a blue for a 3/4 vehicle, and it crews for just 1 power. When Subterranean Scooner attacks, target creature that crewed it this turn explores. So what you're actually looking at right now is the next card in an ever-increasing, ever-longer line of cards that are attempts to fix Smuggler's Copter. I know, it's not quite that, but if you look at it completely sideways with your head cocked all the way at a 90-degree angle, you're like, oh, I see what they're trying to do. It's kind of like a Smuggler's Copter. So, yeah, another thing you could compare this to, though, that we already have in Standard is like Mobilizer Mech, because it's also like a 2-mana, 3/4 vehicle. But I think this is actually way better. Mech crews for 3, which is way, way more than crewing for just 1. And Mobilizer Mech wants you to like be playing a vehicles deck, which is kind of lame. It wants you to have other vehicles out. It's not usually like till turn 4 that you can really take advantage of the value Mech gives you. I've played with this card. It's not terrible, but it also kind of feels bad sometimes. This gives you a buttload of value. Your 1-drop can crew it. Your 3-drop can crew it basically no matter what that 3-drop is. I think that's kind of cool too. So almost basically any creature can crew this, and that usually makes this huge difference, and you're making that creature bigger theoretically, or you're drawing cards. And I love the flavor. This is what a boat should do. We've seen a bunch of boats in Magic the Gathering. This is the first boat that's like, hey, this boat lets a creature explore. That's what a boat does. It makes perfect sense. So I like that. It could, in fact, even be a boat. But can we calm down a little bit and look at Braided Net next? This is 3 mana, 2 and a blue for an artifact that ETBs with 3 net counters on it. You can tap it and remove a net counter from it to tap another target non-land permanent. Its activated abilities can't be activated for as long as it remains tapped. You can also craft with artifact for just 1 and a blue, a really low craft cost. And you get Braided Kipu. This is an artifact that has 3 blue tap. Draw a card for each artifact you control, then put Braided Kipu into its owner's library, 3rd from the top. So that ability on the backside costs an awful lot of mana, sort of. 4 mana is, I'm sorry, it is kind of a lot. You can't do a whole lot more on your turn if you actually activate this, which is lame because you just drew a bunch of cards you want to cast. So hopefully you got some extra mana laying around, but even if you have a couple extra mana, you got 6 mana, you're probably not casting too much after you activate this thing. But with all the map tokens and treasure tokens and clue tokens and food tokens and just tokens, not to mention other artifacts, you can draw a lot off this. Like, I imagine this draws you 4 like fairly easily without any sort of Christmas land scenarios going on. So that's an awful lot of cards. Plus, it actually plays a little bit of defense as soon as you play it, right? You know, it taps the thing down for 3 turns in a row, and it's a non-land permanent. That's not, it doesn't have to be a creature either. So that's kind of neat, but mostly I think you're going to be tapping creatures down for defense. And when it comes time to craft this, only a couple of mana. That is one of the lowest, if not the lowest craft costs we've seen so far, which I do think matters quite a bit. If you don't tap it the turn that you craft it, you can activate it that same turn given enough mana. So I don't know, man. I think it's actually kind of good. It's obviously decent in like the Hilda deck, but I don't think the Hilda deck is that good, to be honest with you. So I'm not sure how relevant that is. So I'm a little excited about this. I think the function is kind of cool. The flavor is really cool. All the stuff it does is sweet. I like drawing a bunch of cards, and I like when blue can play some defense. So I don't hate this thing, to be honest with you, but I don't think it's a great card either. Up next is Enterprising Scallywag. This is 2 mana, 1 and a red for a 2/2 goblin pirate. At the beginning of your end step, if you descended this turn, create a treasure token. So remember, you descend if something goes to your graveyard from literally anywhere. So if something dies in combat, if something died to a removal spell, if something went from your library into your graveyard, for instance, right? If you cast a spell like a sorcery or something that went to your graveyard, you have in fact descended. So you're going to get a treasure token more or less every turn. I would imagine. Like, there are going to be some turns where nothing ends up in your graveyard, but in mono red or big red, right, you're attacking or casting spells, and if you aren't doing those things, you're doing it wrong. So I imagine it's going to be pretty easy to proc this, and having multiples out seems unbelievable, right? But even just having the 1 extra ramp per turn, which you can either cash in or save up to get more ramp as turns go on, like, yeah, and actually, it seems kind of busted a little bit. I don't think it's broken, but I do think even just this, you know, if you're 2-drop, produces 2 treasure tokens for you, which is not that hard to do with this card. I think it's actually done a really good job, especially in decks like Big Red, where, like, yeah, you have access to Charming Scoundrel, you have access to Riveteer's Requisitioner, and I think that Scoundrel might still be the better choice, all things considered, but I will say Scoundrel's not going to get you 2 treasure tokens, whereas this fairly easily can, so I like it. I even like it, like, theoretically at least, in burn decks and stuff, where you might need the extra mana. You're casting spells anyway, right? So So I don't know, man. This 2-drop that can get you like 2-3 treasure tokens over the course of a game, that's kind of ridiculous when you really get to thinking about it. I like it. But next, of all the reprints you expected to see in this set, I bet Resplendent Angel wasn't one of them, but here we go. It's 3 mana, 1 and 2 white for a 3/3 Angel with flying. At the beginning of each end step, if you gained 5 or more life this turn, create a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying and vigilance. You can also pay 3 and 3 white, 6 total mana until end of turn. Resplendent Angel gets +2/+2 and gains lifelink. Not going to be fooled by this one a second time either, man. When this first came out, I think you can go back to the spoiler video when this first came out, and I was like, oh my god, it's the best card I've ever seen. And I don't know what I was thinking. That was right around the time when a 3-mana 3/3 flyer still looked really impressive, but this may be the first card that taught us that a 3-mana 3/3 flyer actually isn't that impressive anymore. So we all learned that lesson thanks to Resplendent Angel. In case you weren't there the first time, this does look really impressive, and I think that there are standard environments this could be very impressive in, but I'm not convinced this is one of them. We do have Giada. We didn't have Giada last time Resplendent Angel was in standard, so that's kind of neat. But we have a bunch of other angels that play really well in the 3-drop slot too, but I'm pretty sure you can shake a couple of them out of the deck and find room for Resplendent Angel because it is a very sweet card. I was also just lamenting the other night on stream while trying to play Black-White Life Gain that we don't have enough like life gain things in standard, like real life gain payoffs, and now we have a life gain payoff that gives us 4/4 flyers. So that's pretty sweet. We also have a life gain payoff now that blows every other creature on the table up. So getting some pretty good Black-White Life Gain cards in this set, and I kind of like that a little bit, but we'll see about Resplendent Angel. This can take over a game by itself if they don't have the removal for it, but as we all learned a few years ago, they somehow always have it. I don't know, man. But this is a good card. I'm not going to deny it that, but a form of interaction does take it out. But you can't always use dice to removal as your premium, like your premier argument, right? And I'm not trying to do that here. Mostly my argument is one that comes from experience, thinking the card was going to be good, but hopefully it's set up to do some stuff in standard this time around. I'm watching it. Let's look at Dowsing Device next. 2 mana, 1 and a red for an artifact. When it or another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, up to 1 target creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains haste until end of turn. Then transform Dowsing Device if you control 4 or more artifacts. It transforms into Geo Grotto, a cave that taps for red, or you can pay 2 a red and tap it, and until end of turn, target creature gains haste and gets +X/+0, where X is the number of artifacts you control. Activate only as a sorcery. I actually think it pushes this card a little bit that it has its own enter the battlefield trigger, right? Like it does something when it ETBs. And from then on, if you're playing like 2-3 artifacts a turn, then suddenly you're actually getting a pretty wide spread of like power bonuses on your creatures. If you're playing creatures, you can go ahead and give them haste right away. I think that's important for the kind of decks this wants to go in. I've already discussed this sort of red-white artifacts deck, but it's looking more mono-red by the day, isn't it? But, you know, this sort of red-X artifact deck that's an aggro deck at its core, and it needs fast pieces. Well, we got the flail that looks like a bone splitter yesterday, and today we get this, which again, actually kind of serves as a bit of an anthem effect while it's still just the 2-drop, but in these decks it's going to be super easy to get 4 artifacts out. This is one of the easier things to transform in the entire set in your artifacts deck, right? Because it transforms by like turn 3 fairly easily, and when it does, you get a really, really sweet land. Like not only is the land a little bit of ramp, but even if you get swept, you obviously get to keep the land, and any creature you play is going to get at least, you know, +1/+0 if it's an artifact, and haste till end of turn. So again, in terms of like protecting against sweepers and stuff, this makes basically anything you draw off the top of your library that's a creature live in your artifacts deck, which I think is also like really worth pointing out. But you can set up huge hits in the late game and the mid game even with a card like this, so long as it's a land, because, you know, on a normal turn, you're going to be tapping it to give like at least +4/+0, +5/+0. It sucks you can only do it at sorcery speed, but you're going to be getting some relatively big boosts out of this thing. So card looks a little bit dangerous to me. I like it. Now, something I think I like even more though is Clay-Fired Bricks. This is 2 mana, 1 and a white for an artifact. When an ETBs, search your library for a basic plains, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle, and you gain 2 life. You can also craft with artifact for 7 mana. That's 5 and 2 white, but you'll get Cosmium Kiln. This is an artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you get 2 1/1 colorless gnome artifact creature tokens. Thanks, 7 mana. But also, creatures you control get +1/+1. Okay, I mean, it's no ambitious farmhand, but I guess it's an artifact. You might care about that. It gains you life, which ambitious farmhand doesn't do. It also doesn't block, which ambitious farmhand does. So, you know, sometimes I think ambitious farmhand is actually going to be worth technically more life in some situations, but still, you know, we see stuff like this. 2 mana, go grab a plains in white all the time, especially these last few years. And these are often quite playable cards, right? So I kind of like it. If you do have the opportunity in the probably very late game to turn it over, then suddenly, again, all those Wandering Emperor or just Planeswalker tokens, those wedding announcement tokens that you got sitting around, they all get +1/+1, and even throws a couple more tokens at you because, you know, yo, dog, heard you like tokens. So that seems pretty sweet. You actually get 4 power out of flipping this over, but the Anthem effect at the point in the game where you do get to flip it over is probably really important and allows you to alpha on some board states. So seems kind of cool. Decent value up front, decent value on the back. Sure, it costs 7 mana to craft it. That's so much mana, but it's got a lot of use at both points in the game where it wants to be used. So I like this card. Well, let's look at Brass's Tunnel Grinder next. This is 3 mana, 2 and a red for a legendary artifact. When it enters the battlefield, discard any number of cards, then draw that many cards +1. At the beginning of your end step, if you descended this turn, put a boar counter on Brass's Tunnel Grinder. Then, if there are 3 or more boar counters on it, remove those counters and transform it into Tecutlan. Go into Tecutlan the. Go into Tecutlan go into Tecutlan go into Tecutlan the Searing Rift. This is a legendary cave that taps for red, or whenever you cast a permanent go into Tecutlan the Searing Rift. This is a legendary cave that taps for red, and whenever you cast a permanent spell using mana produced by Tecutlan the Searing Rift, discover X, where X is that spell's mana value. All right, so this is one of the cards that I was referencing at the beginning when I said we got a couple of cards today that might be a little bit busted. I think this might be one of them. It does take a bunch of turns and the effective skipping of your 3rd turn to actually get this flipped over. But once you do, whenever you cast a permanent, Discover is bonkers. It's actually kind of concerning that a card like this exists. When it does flip over, it gives you the ramp. Proliferate is a thing in this format. I feel like I should probably point that out. You get 1 counter on this and then proliferate twice, boom, it flips over. That's actually kind of sick. So I don't know, man. Yet again, Big Red is starting to look like it can actually do some stuff in this format, but I feel like I say that in pretty much every set. But then again, in every set, a bunch of content creators put out a Big Red video where they go like 7-0 in Arena with Big Red. So I think there's been something there for quite some time, and it just keeps getting more and more pieces by the day with each new set that comes out. And this looks like a decent piece. I know that it's 3 mana up front, but you do kind of get an effect that we've seen on a couple of cards recently, that it basically allows you to draw a +1 card and filter out all the garbage in your hand, which I've always liked, you know, in a Reanimator deck or something like that. This seems halfway decent at the very least, but I feel like I say Reanimator way too often. But anything that allows you to discard like this, I think might be okay for obvious reasons. But one way or the other, once you do get it flipped over, it seems like one of the more busted lines of text in a set full of broken lines of text. But now let's look at Scytheclaw of the Sun. This is 2 mana, 1 and a red for a 2/2 legendary human knight. Whenever you attack, you may discard a card. When you do, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature. It gains trample until end of turn. Whenever you discard 1 or more cards, exile the top card of your library. You may play it until your next end step. All right, so when it comes to this card, there are in fact 2 wolves inside of me. The first wolf is like, well, this is just a grizzly bear, so let's eat it. You know, it's a 2 mana 2/2 scuffed. Get it out of my face. Never gonna see play. The flippant, glib, disaffected hipster content creator that I was mentioning earlier, that I know some of you like. I've seen you in the back liking it. Now, that person really wants to dismiss this card, but the other wolf inside of me really wants to play with this card, because that wolf is in fact not a wolf. It's a Pomeranian puppy that just wants to play with stuff. And that's who I actually am on the inside. So I'm kind of excited about this card. For one, this is the other thing that came out today that made me think they're gonna do madness soon. aren't they? Are they just going to do madness? They're going to come on, you rascals. I see what you're doing. So there's that speculation. Gets way better if we get madness as a keyword ability in the next few sets. But even just aside from that, my first thought when you think about this card in mono red is that, well, mono red needs all of its cards. You don't want to discard any cards in mono red unless you're getting some real value off of it, because all of your cards matter so much in an aggro deck like mono red. You can't waste any of them, right? So there is that, but this card solves a problem that it creates, right? Because it's giving you value off the top of your library for discarding those cards. Now, you don't have forever to play the cards, which is kind of lame. Sometimes you do want to play the cards in your hand. And if you don't play the cards you got off the top of your library, it's gone forever. So like it can create some logistical issues, but we've already seen that with a bunch of cards in mono red today, like Felden and Reckless Impulse and stuff. This is not a decision that is foreign to any mono red player at this point. You play the card that is better to play no matter where it's coming from. Hot tip. So in any case, just having access to more cards is always going to be a good thing. But we got to keep it pushing because we're looking at big stuff now, in case you hadn't noticed. This is Oyer, Pakati, Deepest Epoch. This is 4 mana, 2 and 2 blue for a 4/3 legendary god with flying. Whenever you cast an instant spell from your hand, it gains rebound. In case you haven't read this ability in a while, exile it as it resolves. At the beginning of your next upkeep, you may cast it from exile without paying its mana cost. When Oyer Pakati dies, return it to the battlefield tapped and transformed under its owner's control with 3 time counters on it. It transforms into the Temple of Cyclical Time. This is a land. You tap it for blue and remove a time counter from it. You can also pay 2 and a blue and tap it and transform it back into the creature. Activate only if it has no time counters on it and only as a sorcery. So to me, this looks like it was in the Commander set. And they were like, just put it in the main set. You know, it randomly has a rebound. That's not an ability that we've really seen on a standard card in a while, and for good reason. It's kind of broken if you're not doing it right. And I don't think they're doing it right because it looks a little bit broken. This is another one of the cards this video that I think that might just be busted, you know? Like it dies to removal, and I understand that, but then it comes back. You know, something's telling me after seeing a couple of these gods in the set that exile removal is going to go through the roof in playability when the set comes out. We already had like legendary dragons from Kamigawa, Tenacious Underdog, Mosswood Dread Knight. Like there's a bunch of creatures in standard that make you want to play exile removal already, but like having these dudes around, dude, really good. I mean, a 4 mana 4 power flyer hasn't been great in a while. We keep having to learn the lesson that 4 mana 4 power flyers aren't that great. The most recent one I think was Decadent Dragon. Still doesn't really see any play, which is just crazy. It's a very good Magic card. But this, on the other hand, is not just a 4 mana 4 power flyer. It's one of those that flips into ramp when it dies and then comes back, you know, over and over and over, given that you have enough time. But let me actually, again, get back to the good part of the card, the thing that makes it look like a Commander card to me. Rebound is a nasty ability, man. It only works with instants and not sorceries in this case, but I don't care. Even just rebounding a card draw spell, or especially like a go for the throat or something, seems back-breaking, dude. Like you have broken the game state, the board state, and your opponent's ego. If you actually are able to untap with this and double up on a removal spell and get on in, I think you're doing really well. You swung the board state a lot at that point. So if this stays in play for a turn, oh, the things it can do. But obviously, that is a bigger ask than it sounds. Experienced Magic players, I'm well aware of that. But untapping with this in play and actually having something to fuel it, an instant in your hand, is probably the kind of situation that it's almost impossible to escape from if you're the opponent. So I've got some hopes for this thing. But next, let's look at Helping Hand all the way down here in the uncommon slot, but I think it's that good. A single white mana for a sorcery. Return target creature with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So this is a strictly worse version of one of my favorite cards of all time, but it's color shifted, so that's okay. This is just Unearth. It's just, look at it. It is Unearth. It doesn't cycle. The creature comes into play tapped. That does matter. I was going to say, who cares? I kind of do a little bit. Kind of sucks, but all the versions of this that we've seen recently, and I feel like we've been seeing a lot of versions of this card recently, have all cost 2 mana. This costing 1 mana, bananas. Like absolutely bananas, dude. Being able to get like an Adeline back or a Brutal Cathar back, can you imagine that? Or any number of 3-drop creatures in this environment. Who, like, even just like Esper, like Phaliolus Esper, you know what I mean? They get their Raffine back, their Denic back, all their 2-drop creatures back, their Skrell, they can bring that back if they want to. Just basically anything in their deck that's not named Shieldred, they can bring back with this card. So, I don't know, man. Again, just seems dangerous. Today is full of dangerous cards, man. This produces a great deal of mana value. So, like on turn 3 or 4, if you can get back a 3-drop or something that you've either dropped in your graveyard or lost up to that point and still have 2 or 3 mana to play something else to the board, then I think you're doing really, really well. Let's take a look at Kite Sail Larcenous next. This is 3 mana, 2 and a blue for a 2/3 human pirate with flying and ward 1. When Larcenous enters the battlefield, for each player, choose up to 1 other target artifact or creature that player controls. For as long as Larcenous remains on the battlefield, the chosen permanents become treasure artifacts with tap, sack this artifact, add a mana of any color, and they lose all their other abilities. Sometimes I really do like to see blue removal, especially on a body like this. It seems pretty decent, man. Like, there's a reason this card is all the way up here in the video. It's got a fairly decent spread of targets it can hit. When it's on a 5-mana counterspell, I don't like that it can only hit artifacts and creatures. But when it's on a 3-mana creature, I will take the fact that it hits artifacts and creatures that are already on the table. It seems much, much better. Sometimes your opponent can just remove this and get their thing back and they don't really care. And then other times you're ramping them for removing their guy or whatever. And that's not super ideal, but a lot of the time in blue, I think you'll take this effect. Also especially good in Commander, where it can catch like 3 different things in its net when it enters the battlefield. At the very least, you know, if you're playing with 8 players, nobody does that anymore, but if you are... We used to call it chaos magic. But anyway, if you're playing with that many, it's absolutely absurd. But on a normal commander table, being able to eat 3 things when it comes into play is pretty unbelievable. It's kind of absurd. But even in 60-card constructed one-on-one formats, I actually think this could still work in like a mono blue deck or something like that. So kind of a sweet little enter the battlefield trigger that I do like. I can't help but like, can I like cards sometimes? I think that it's actually not going to end up seeing all the play in the world, but I do think that it's a really neat, well-designed card that beyond just being well-designed is actually potentially competitive viable. We'll have to wait and see though. But if you wanted a playable blue card, I have got one for you. This is Tishana's Tidebinder, 3 mana, 2 and a blue for a 3/2 Merfolk wizard with flash. When Tidebinder enters the battlefield, counter target activated or triggered ability. If an ability from an artifact, creature, or planeswalker is countered this way, that permanent loses all abilities for as long as Tishana's Tidebinder remains on the battlefield. So I guess this is how they decided to answer the One Ring. The One Ring can be completely nerfed by this little Merfolk lady. That's all there is. But of course, she can be somewhat easily removed too, and you just go back to one ringing in modern or whatever. But back in standard, where I'm a little bit more comfortable, this is going to counter a bunch of stuff. You know, this is going to counter like Shieldred triggers, obviously, and then keep Shieldred from triggering for the rest of the game. If they try to flash in like Wandering Emperor or something and use one of its Planeswalker's abilities, right, you just counter that ability and suddenly you blank Wandering Emperor for the rest of the game. It works that way with all Planeswalkers too, which is kind of also absurd. Honestly, I keep using that word because it's the best word for some of these cards, man. I think this is powerful enough to see play in standard and modern and commander and everything from standard to modern, explorer, pioneer, historic, whatever. So what else you got? So I think this could go way back and see play even in things like Legacy, but I don't know enough about Legacy to make that call. But activated and triggered abilities are even more important in those formats, obviously. But I think in just about every format you can play this card, it's probably going to see some play. I mean, a 3-mana 3/2 flash, is that did I get the body right? 3-mana 3/2 flash, yes. That's not the most impressive thing in the world, but the text box this stops all manner of nonsense, and I think in a ton of different formats, it's going to be a card that sees more play than I think some people might think at first glance. But there are just so many good targets, and it comes with a body, and they're locked down from doing anything else with the card until they get rid of this thing. Like, yeah, man, that is super, super annoying. And the one thing I will say is that, you know, decks like, say, Atraxa in standard, one of the best decks in standard, one of the 2 best decks in standard is Atraxa right now. And obviously this card nerfs Atraxa tremendously. They try to get the ETB trigger off of it and they can't, so that's kind of a big deal against those decks. But the best way to combat Atraxa decks was already to play blue, right? Like I want stuff in other colors that's good against Atraxa. The same thing goes for Wandering Emperor and Rafine and all the good like Esper stuff like Sheoldred, right? So this card helps deal with that. But you're basically just playing the mirror because you were also playing blue against the blue deck. And I wish that this is the answer to so many things in Standard and beyond right now, that I wish it hadn't been blue. But at this point, I'm just nitpicking, right? So we get in one card an answer to a lot of the cards that annoy me and a lot of us the most. And I got to praise that. But, ooh, that is it, everybody. We have made it to the other side. 20 cards down and I don't know, a couple hundred more to go before spoiler season's all said and done. So don't go anywhere. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done it yet, because we have got a bunch more cards to cover. Plus, top 10 sleepers, top 25 cards, deck techs, all kinds of wacky stuff, video essays. Just stick with the channel for all the Lost Caverns of Ixalan stuff. Plus, we got the holiday, Halloween, budget mono black cube coming up. There's all kinds of content you want to be clued in on. But aside from that, I guess I'm basically donezo. So just do all the YouTube stuff. Like the video, sub, like I said, to the sandwich. Hit up the Twitch, follow for free over there. We're going to be doing at least maybe one more night of spoiler season over on Twitch live. It's always a party. It's always a lot of fun. Come join us. Check out the Patreon. I need patrons at this point. Not only is it just $1 a month, but you'll get to vote on what we do when we actually get into this Lost Caverns of Ixalan format. So $1 to do that, I feel like it's a pretty decent deal. But aside from that, you'll be supporting the channel, which I greatly appreciate, and also is a necessity because otherwise I would be living in a cardboard condo. So I really appreciate the patrons. You guys are keeping me alive, basically. So thanks, guys. But aside from that, I am actually done. Just let me know how you felt about today's spoilers. What are your favorite cards? Is there anything you can do with these that I didn't mention that you're excited to do? Like all that stuff, it's your turn now. But aside from that, I am finally actually done. Third time I've told you I'm done. I mean it this time. I'm Deb from the place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.